What were a few social issues that occurred while you were growing up?
World War II was just finishing, and I didn't realize until reflecting later how close that was to my parents, and it affected them in their life, so naturally trickled down to us. So a lot of the things that were happening in my early growing up years was a function of what had happened to them and the world a few years earlier. So that was one. The Kennedy assassination was 1960 or 61. That had a big effect on the world and on us. The Cuban Missile Crisis before that, we were very afraid of communists. I remember in public and maybe high school, public school in particular, we were frightened of Russian bombs coming, atomic bombs, so we all had to learn where to shelter. It's a little like tornado warnings that you get now. You learn to go to the basement and do those things. Well, ours was to learn how to avoid an atomic bomb. And some people stocked their basements with food because they were fearful that they might not be able to come out for days or weeks or months. That was a big scare for us. Of course, it all frittered away, but thankfully we were able to make peace rather than have it turn into a war. And in spite of some of the things we see today around us, every day is bad news with war, we have, in fact, society has kept it together. We haven't had a major war involving all of the youth, or so many of the youth of our generations, yours and mine, since that time. Mm-hmm. So in spite of all the things wrong, we're doing a few things right, too.
How did you get into the art industry?
Well, art, a little like wanderlust, was something inside me. And as a kid, I loved to draw pictures, but never took it very seriously. And then travels, family, career, all got in the way. But at a period of time after, I was established, and I found I had a little time to dabble with art again, and people began to like what I was doing. It was mostly wood carving at the beginning that was noted around Midland, and people would ask me to make things for them or carve things. So suddenly it became a parallel career. Wood became metal, and when I worked with the Waltech group that I mentioned, Kindred stainless steel sinks. Stainless steel was the material we used there. Hudson Levins, the previous president at Kindred, came to me and said, you know, we need something, a project for to celebrate the millennium. He knew the answer, but he wanted me to find it. So he continued asking questions. What's a good symbol of Midland? What about the Y Marsh? What's the Y Marsh famous for? Finally, I came along and caught on to what he was saying. I said, oh, a trumpeter swan. Oh, brilliant idea, Ron, Hudson said. So we agreed if he did the legwork on clearing the path with the town and so on, I'd do the artwork and make it happen. So that's where the idea of the swan came from. The design took a year of laying things out on paper, making paper models. I had a friend who was a hunter, and he had a Canada goose that he kept in the freezer for us to use for modeling. We worked on that and got the anatomy correct. And then into production, and a number of the people at Kindred helped me with the construction. Bill Fielder being the key helper. He's a welder and millwright, and just the man that knows metal very well. So he and I worked together for another year, with others joining in from time to time to help with polishing, and then 2 years after, we took it down late at night to the town dock with a crew of helpers and the PUC, and the next morning the swan was standing there. We put a cover over it, and then an official opening followed soon after that.
What are some art trends that you noticed within the art industry, and what are some positive and negative effects of them?
In art. Well, I think there's more public awareness to art now than there was in my day. Art was rather exclusive, and it was a very small segment of the population that had an interest or the means to invest in other people's art or to get involved in doing their own art. And now I think we're much more free. You're free to create what you want in any way you want, and I think it's probably encouraged at school. Do you have art class? Yep. Yeah. We had art class, but it was quite rigid and not very flexible, but it was useful. But really, real art comes from inside, and if you're interested, you find a way to do it. So I think the difference is, with that interest, the opportunities are much greater now than they were then.
You've mentioned you love to travel. Can you describe some of your adventures for us?
All right, here we go. This is my favorite travel story. When Mary and I went to Borneo, we lived on the coast, but on the interior is where the headhunters lived. So we had a friend, another QSO volunteer, working partway up one of the rivers that went into the interior. So we went to visit him, and he said, well, you know, there's a village just upstream and back in the forest, a longhouse along the river. And I thought that would be very interesting to go and visit. So I walked out and came upon the longhouse. So the longhouse had about 40 families living in it. So I went up and I spoke a little bit of Malay language. Saya cakap Melayu sikit-sikit saja. That means I speak a little bit of Malay. And they had a dialect, so we could communicate that way. And there were others, some with a smattering of English, others with a smattering of more formal Malay. So amongst the group, we were able to communicate. The protocol is to ask for the tuai ruma. Tuai means the chief of the house. And so I did, and there was a little flurry of activity, and an old man came out, really grizzled old man. So we sat in a little circle, talking back and forth, and I asked him about the old days and the Second World War. So the Japanese had invaded Malaysia and Borneo in the day, and they were pretty brutal. Borneo was a British colony at the time, so the British had been expelled by the Japanese, but the people were loyal to the British and the headhunters. I didn't mention, but this longhouse was the longhouse of previous headhunters. I mean, people who lived there had previously been headhunters. And this old man was one of them. And one of the signs of the headhunters, they tattoo on their throat as a young teenager. So these guys had the tattoos. The other sign is they tattooed one knuckle of one finger of one hand for every head they'd taken. And I mean, lopped off the head of their enemies. And I saw people with a lot of black knuckles. Anyway, the old man, I asked him about that, and he didn't mind telling the story. So since we were in part English, part Malay, part local language, indigenous language, it was also part pantomime. So the old fellow pretended he was a Japanese soldier marching through the jungle with his gun on his shoulder. And And then he became the headhunter, scrunched down into a tiny little ball with a long blowpipe. They used poison darts that in a little quiver that went in the end of the blowpipe, which was 6 feet long or so, and a little spear on the end of that. And so he got his blowpipe out, and you could see imagine the marchers marching. One little puff from the pipe, and suddenly the marcher grabbed his neck like he was swatting a mosquito, and then went into convulsions and fell down onto the path. And now my old man became the headhunter again, pulled out his big long knife and went over and lopped off the head of the Japanese soldier, the last one in the line of marchers, all silent, and disappeared off into the jungle. My heart was just thumping. And at the same time, in the hut, there are heads hanging in baskets. They're old and dusty and dirty. Headhunting was outlawed after the Second World War, probably before the war, but it was re-encouraged by the British to fight the Japanese. The original headhunting was tribal, one tribe against another. Anyway, imagine that old fellow telling the story and the heads hanging up silently from the beams of the longhouse. Well, it was a story. But the other side of it is, fierce as they may seem, they were the most gentle and hospitable people, and always generous to offer tea, or tapai was their rice wine. Anyway, happily I spent my time with them, walked home through the jungle back to my friend's place, and I've had a great story to tell ever since.
We'd both like to thank you for taking your time to speak with us.
Well, thank you. It's certainly been my pleasure. It's not often I get to tell old stories, so I quite enjoy it. And I really appreciate what you guys are doing, and with history, and asking all the right questions. Those were good questions.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.